Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Annelies, for your introduction. Thank you to the EUROPALIA and Kazerne Dossin team for the kind invitation and for the organization. Normally, in the original, my original intent for the original date, I believe it was the 27th of January when this conference was originally planned. I was planning to tell you more about the historical content of the role of the Belgian National Railway Company, the NMBS, SNCB, in the deportations during the Second World War. We did research in the framework of what later resulted in gewillig België, la Belgique docile, so the official inquiry investigation in the role of the Belgian authorities in the deportation of the Jewish people during the Second World War in Belgium. We did research also about the Belgian National Railway Company. I was involved in that research, so I was planning on mostly drawing from that research to tell you more about the historical content and our findings. But since then, the situation has changed, which places me in a somewhat difficult position in the sense that it's difficult for me to go into the historical content, as I will explain in 30 seconds. In January of this year, the decision was made to give my institute, CegeSoma, the assignment to launch an official investigation into the role of the Belgian National Railway Company, which places me a bit in the position that it's very difficult for me to anticipate to the results of this, which is now an ongoing investigation. So, I hope you will excuse me that for today I will just present to you the framework of the investigation, our framework, the context, our approach, the challenges, and that I will not go too much into detail into the historical actual questions, not to anticipate too much on the end results. There might be time in the Q&A for more specific questions, obviously. But for now, I will just limit myself to presenting you the framework of this investigation. And I put, just to summarize the essentials, I put the essential framework in one slide. So, as I already mentioned, the assignment was given, the decision was made by Minister Georges Gilquinet, responsible for mobility for the NMBS SNCB, and also the Belgian Senate in January of this year to give the assignment to CegeSoma, part of the State Archives, to launch the investigation with the central question about the role of the SNCB NMBS in the deportations during World War II of Jews and Roma, political prisoners and forced laborers. Now, immediately the question, why these three very different victim categories? Obviously, it's not at all the intention to, let's say, assimilate these three very different victim categories. We are talking about victims of racial persecution, victims of political persecution, and victims of economic persecutions, if you will. So these are obviously completely uncomparable victim categories, but it makes sense to bring them together in a historical research for two reasons. First, because from the point of view of the Belgian authorities, there was no separate, let's say, file or a separate problem of deportations of Jewish people. This was a general context and a general problem and a general set of decision-making questions connected to military transports for the Germans. So it's from the historical point of view to have a good understanding of exactly the entire process behind these deportations. It makes sense to have a much broader focus and also look at the other victim categories that were deported. There was also a very pragmatic reason, which is that we already know from the already mentioned Belgique docile gewillig België research that there will be very little directly relevant archives for the Jewish deportations to be found. We already looked through the proceedings of the board of directors, for example, of the NMBS in 2005, 2006. And the deportation of Jews is never mentioned. It is, as surreal as this may sound today, this was not an important issue. It was not an important problem for the Belgian board of directors in 1942, for example. So, in order to broaden our chance, to increase our chance to find relevant information about the deportation of Jewish people, perhaps in discussions about deportations of political prisoners, for example, because, like I said, it is more or less an interconnected set of questions. To increase our chances to find relevant archives, it made sense to broaden our scope, our archival scope. So this is why we have a broader, we broadened our question. So we are now fully preparing the launch of the research. Hasn't yet been launched. We will create a scientific advisory committee, of which Kazerne Dossin will also obviously form part. We are currently beginning to negotiate. That sounds very heavy, but the NMBS SNCB is very willing to give us access to their archives, but we also need to look at the practical modalities of consulting these archives. The investigation will actually be launched the 1st of August. This is new information because I can now confirm that we have found a researcher very recently, just a couple of days ago, who can start at the 1st of August, and this is the moment when the actual research, the empirical research in the archives will actually start. This person will do the empirical work for 6 months. The plan right now is to present the final report in October 2023, which will be presented before the Belgian Senate. This is historical research. The questions, a set of questions, and the objectives of this research are purely historical, so we will not be giving any policy recommendations, for example. We won't be giving any advisory political recommendations. This is something that is up to different actors, policymakers, and different involved actors after the report. This is purely a historical report. So the elements of the investigation will be focused on 2 main levels of inquiry. First, the chain of decision making on the central level, or on the top level, which will mean putting the chain of decision making and also therefore the responsibilities of the different actors in their specific context, shifting responsibilities, because the occupation was a period in which the context evolved and changed very, very rapidly, but also on the level of the practical execution. Laurence already mentioned, for example, the different stations from which people were deported. So that practical questions like that, the actual implementation of the deportations, when and how and were Germans present in these deportations? Were there protests? Were there even margins for the space for protests? What was potential opposition or resistance? What was the impact of resistance? So on a very practical level. Meaning we need to integrate the NMBS SNCB in this broader economic and administrative so-called policy of the lesser evil. This is the broader Belgian occupation context, talking about the judicial international law, but also national laws that applied, the broader judicial context, the shifting policies, the formal responsibilities, the different actors. The analysis also of the financial, economic, corporate policy of the NMBS during the occupation, because the financing system, the way, and I'm sorry to use the cynical word, but the business model, so to speak, that the NMBS used during the Second World War is obviously an extremely important part of this inquiry. And I can also say that this is also very new. Like 4 or 5 weeks ago, we discovered in the state archives the entire financial analysis which was made in 45, 46 after the Second World War in the archives of the military justice. So the expert analysis of the financial policy of the NMBS, which is a new finding. So there are still some new archives to be found. So this is an important question, and then also, like I said, the practical organization of the entire system of deportations within this general transport system. Big challenges, archives and time are the big challenges. There, like I already more or less hinted at, there is no clear centralized file where you can go to investigate this specific question. So archives are fragmented. Like I said, the Holocaust was a bit of a blind spot in the archives, which we already know because we already tried to find these archives in 2005, 2006. Archives are fragmented, so up until a big point we will have to make calculated guesses based on our experience in serial archives. So in a lot of ways we will also need to look for needles in a haystack a little bit. But there are archives, of course, archives of the SNCB, NMBS that were transferred to the state archives, the archives of the Directorate of Personnel and Social Service, which is a very big archive, and the proceedings of the Ministerial Council after the war. These archives are the first main focus. Other archives in the state archives are the files in the military courts in the central office of the chief military prosecutor. This is the cover of the penal file of Narcisse Rouleau, the general director of the SNCB. So the investigation after the war into his conduct by the military justice courts. There are also are many other potential archives we can use, of which we do not yet know how much information we're going to find. Archives of the war damages, the Ministry of Transport archives, Service of the Service of Economic Recuperation. There is a file on the NMBS in the archives of the Société Générale. We were able to identify it, so it exists. I just do not yet know what's actually in those files, but it exists. So there are fragmented, but there are archives that exist. In the state archives, the archives currently managed, preserved by the NMBS SNCB themselves, the proceedings of the board of directors, the circular letters of the commercial service to their subservient different services, organization seat reports of the station supervisor, service records with a question mark, because it remains to be seen what exactly. There is no inventory, and there exists no inventory of the archives of the NMBS. So we need to go there with the responsibles of the NMBS for the archives and look exactly what remains and how easy it is to consult it. So, and we will also see whether there is still archives in the Bundesarchiv, which is also a question mark right now. Archives of, for example, the Wehrmacht-Verkehrsdirektion. What still exists in the Bundesarchiv, so that remains also a question mark. And we will also Varia. I don't like the title Varia because it's everything and nothing, obviously, but it's also still a big question mark whether we will be able to use oral sources, the sources of testimonies, private archives. For me, currently, that is something we also need to see with our scientific partners, such as Kazerne, Dossin. So, in any way, fragmented archives and a rather limited timing. Like I said, 6-month empirical research, somebody who really needs to do the groundwork every day in the archives, 1st of August. And this I already mentioned. The end result, what are we trying to achieve by the end of next year? On the one hand, it will be a historical report. It will be, because we're talking about a very complex historical set of questions, so this will be a historical report with a lot of nuances, a lot of different actors, judicial context, political context, so it will be very, very complex. I can imagine it will be like a book, like a historical report of, I don't know, 100, 200, 300 pages, I have no idea. But I also think that in light of the specific framework of this and the specific questions that the assignment that is given to our institute, that we also need to come up with clear answers of some sort. Not policy recommendations, like I said, that is not our framework or our assignment, but I do think we need to come up with some clear answers to some clear questions. I think that is also our assignment. So I can imagine that besides the, let's say, broad historical report, we will also deliver an executive summary. I'm sorry for the managerial speak, but some kind of a clear resume, a bullet point question and answers, very brief document, which will, like I said, gives answers to the most obvious questions on responsibilities, for example. So that is, I'm afraid, the basics of the investigation that are the basics of what I wanted to tell you today. So the basic framework. I can imagine there remains a lot of questions, but I hope I respected the timing, so there will still be time in the Q&A for specific, more detailed questions, of which I'm sure there will be. But for now, this is the framework of the investigation, and I thank you for listening to me. Thank you.